Hello again, YouTube. I'm going to skip the apologies for not making a video in a while because I already included that in a video I already recorded. Instead, I want to talk about a video that MrRepzion, henceforth referred to as Daniel, made recently, because it has become the hot topic lately amongst the little community or area of YouTube that I pay attention to talk about this issue of racism. Is the amazing atheist a raging racist? Is Steve Shives a complete asshole? And so on. And when these topics start to take off, you see other people start to talk about them, or it's just a matter of timing. It's in the culture. And I don't want to talk about all those other things, although I will recommend a rather long, like 7 hours long discussion that some people I very much respect on YouTube made in Shayrah's Salon. They had a roundtable discussion talking about Steve Shives and that whole situation. And I know a while back I mentioned Steve Shives and people were like, oh my god, I can't believe. I guess I just wasn't in the loop of what that whole deal was, so if I upset you by mentioning him, I apologize. But let's move on from that. So, Daniel, you make this video where you try and prove that Onision is like way out of line for saying that people, heterosexual men who are not interested in dating black women are racist. Or it would seem to be racist of them.
Refusing to date black women is racist? I mean, if you think about it, it kind of is, right? Here's the definition of racism. It's basically where you discriminate on another race because you think your own race is superior. In other words, if you're a white guy who thinks white women are hotter than black women and therefore say you won't date black women, sounds a lot like racism.
That's Onision's idea, and you're saying that's ridiculous because subjective preference. And I think throughout this video you just completely put your foot in your mouth and you got a lot of approval from your fans for it, and I'm sorry, I just have to step in and say something, because it's like, did you listen to yourself before you released this video? Now, here's the first thing. I think that when these issues like racism come up, that essentially you have a situation where somebody is talking about racism, not in terms of going out on somebody's lawn in a hood and burning a cross on their lawn and those forms of overt racism, but they very often talk about things like bias, which is, by the way, a synonym for discrimination. Okay, we'll use the term bias because I think it will help in terms of talking about subjectivity. It'll come in handy later, right? So, you have this self-image. You're a good person. You don't treat other people badly. You don't treat other people differently. In your own mind, you are not a racist. So if somebody confronts you with something that makes you feel like a racist, because I see a massive amount of self-defense and defensiveness in your response, Daniel, then their definition of racism must be wrong. They're being a ridiculous social justice warrior. Now, don't get me wrong, there are, in my opinion, such things as social justice warriors. Not that I think that every social justice advocate is a social justice warrior, but some are. There are certain people who, when they see somebody do something problematic, it's not merely that they want to correct them or change that person's mind, it's that they want to destroy that person. They want their head on a spike. They want their television show canceled. They don't want to reach out to the other person. It's just that person is a piece of garbage and they completely write them off. That is part of what I would define a social justice warrior as being. That sort of person. That person there did something I don't like, they're garbage. That the person with that mentality is basically what I would define as a social justice warrior, along with some other things, but that's a different story. So you, Daniel, imagine yourself as a good person. So if somebody points out an instance where you might be biased, you're like, I'm a good person. So let's examine your argument for why you believe that you're not a racist for preferring white women, right? You say it's all a matter of subjective preference. It's all subjective. You can't really fault people for their subjective standards of beauty and attractiveness.
The word beauty in of itself is a very subjective term. What you find attractive, what I find attractive, is completely subjective to every single individual. Every single person has their own idiosyncratic aesthetic and preference of what they prefer on people. Every single person is subjective in terms of what they find attractive, and that is okay. That is natural. Aesthetic preferences is not discrimination.
Here's the thing, though. Subjective does not mean that it's entirely invented from within yourself, exclusive of any, excluding any kind of external or social influence. It's not what subjective means. Subjective is not something that just arises completely separate from all of your other experiences. And to a certain extent, our personal preferences are shaped by the culture around us, by our experiences, by our belief systems. And I'm not going to even bother to go as far as to call you a racist. But what I'm going to say is listen to your own words and think, are you perhaps biased in a way that one could be forgiven for calling racist? For example, you say this in your video.
I myself am not attracted to people who are from China, Japan, or any other Asian country around the world.
Okay, you're not attracted to Asian women. So there's something like over 2 billion women. You've decided that you're not attracted to any of them because of their racial features, apparently, but you're not racist or nothing. What? No, seriously, what? This to me is baffling. This attitude of, it just so happens, completely exclusive of any sort of racial bias, that you're not attracted to, like, half the women on the planet, more than half the women on the planet, because they're not white. But but you're not racist or nothing. I don't understand. Again, I think you're being defensive because of your own self-image as a good person. I'm a good person. I don't go burning crosses on people's lawns, so I must not be a racist. But you're clearly demonstrating bias, and bias is a synonym for discrimination. Another thing about this, Daniel, is that you only seem to conceive of racist action in terms of some sort of direct action against someone. So a more passive action you don't perceive as racist, apparently. But let me just change this around. So if somebody says that they're not racist, but they're just not interested in dating a black girl, a heterosexual male says that, you think that's not racist because it's just their personal subjective preferences. But what if we switch dating with hiring? I'm not racist or nothing. I just prefer to hire white people. The racism of that becomes pretty apparent, doesn't it? But it's their subjective preference and who they want to work for them, right? It's completely subjective. So, I mean, how could it possibly be racist or discriminatory? Just listen to what you're saying at this point in the video.
Do you really know what discrimination means? It means treating people differently, less, because of a disability, because of their sexual orientation, because of their skin color.
So racism is discriminating against someone because of their race. But not dating them because of their race is not racist or discriminatory. Why exactly? Because it's something you're not doing? Look, in political theory and philosophy, you have this idea of positive rights versus negative rights, or freedom to versus freedom from. And you can talk about rights in both ways. It's not just what you have the right to do, but what you have the right from being done to you. It goes in both directions. So try and think about racism that way, and discrimination and bias and prejudice that way. That it can both be overt acts of racism and not so overt acts of racism. Not doing something because of someone's race can be every bit as discriminatory as doing something overtly discriminatory. Okay? Now let me clear a few things up going forward. Number one, no one is saying that you have to be attracted to anyone and everyone. That would be ludicrous. Number two, in this discussion, I found myself siding with Onision. Siding with Onision. And for that, Daniel, I cannot forgive you. He made valid points. Honestly, Daniel, I found your video this combination of astonishing and baffling at the same time. And I feel that either you misunderstood Onision, and what you thought he was saying was that unless you find any and every black woman attractive, then you must be a racist, which is not what he was saying, and if that's the assumption that you're working from, then you're just attacking a straw man. Or you did understand him, and you are indeed speaking categorically, and so you're categorically dismissing most black women, most Asian women, but I'm not a racist or nothing, which is, to me, baffling. I suspect that going back to this issue of subjectivity, that you feel attractiveness is something that is beyond your control, and therefore you can't be in any way held accountable for it, or called a racist because of your personal preferences. You didn't outright say that, but that's the impression that I get of what you're essentially trying to argue. But at the same time, as I've already stated, even though something like attractiveness is subjective, your own subjective experiences, beliefs, opinions, etc. are not just born completely independent of outside influence. So how could you explain that you don't find Asian women attractive, and you're apparently speaking categorically about this? You've only ever found a few black women attractive.
Would I be against ever dating a black woman? No, I'm not against it. Have I ever been physically attracted to a black woman? Very, very few.
But you don't think that there's any sort of racial component to that? I mean, I don't want to get down to this like crude level of like, yo, we're two heterosexual dudes, let's talk about how hot women are. I've always avoided trying to do that sort of thing on YouTube. But really, why would you categorically rule out non-white women and then you generally don't find them attractive? Can you give me a explanation that does not involve like racial bias? I hate to repeat a point that Onision made in his video, but if we look at this from a biological level, what's really the point of attractiveness? The feeling that another being is attractive. It's to instigate reproduction. So is there any biological reason why you would find pale white women most suitable for reproduction?
I prefer people to be really, really, really white, because I'm part Finnish. I'm naturally like a ghost already.
I don't see any so-called natural reason why you would find one very specific group of women most attractive, unless you're not clarifying how you actually feel. It would seem from your own statements that you only find a rather narrow section of women attractive and categorically dismiss literally billions of women. I don't see any biological reason for that. So you must have some really idiosyncratic reasons. Now, they might be partly cultural. Okay, you grew up apparently within the United States Western culture where white women are most predominantly the standard of beauty. That's what you see by far the most often in movies, television, beauty magazines, etc. That's what you grew up with. That's what you were constantly exposed to as the standard of beauty. And you probably internalized that from your culture. So it's probably a combination of your own personal experiences and culture, and probably some other factors. But I don't see this as being something that's biological, that's quote-unquote natural. Again, this goes back to the whole race being a social construct thing. Or maybe it's just like you have a preference for, like hair. You see preference for a skin color as being the same as being a preference for like hair color or eye color because you just live in this post-racial mindset or something like that. But if you think that you have this sort of post-racial mindset, you're probably deluding yourself. And I want to say, Daniel, that I'm not making this video to call you out as a racist and say that you're a piece of garbage. Because as I've already explained earlier in the video, that's what social justice warriors do, and I can't stand that sort of behavior. And to an extent, I get that from your internal perspective, you feel as if your own personal preferences and what you're attracted to is not really under your control. And you don't feel that it's fair that you would be held to account and labeled this pejorative based on something that you feel isn't under your control. But what I'm driving at here is the idea that you do seem to possess racial bias based on your own statements. There doesn't seem to be any sort of natural explanation for it. And it may be very well that you have internalized things from your culture. The idea that your own subjective preferences are influenced by the world around you is not some radical idea from some crazy social justice perspective. It's actually pretty much a sure thing. And maybe you should stop and think about the nature of your own preferences and, what's driving them, what shaped them. Because this video that you made seemed to be born out of this knee-jerk reaction to defend your sense of being a good person because you're not overtly a racist. And the idea of being called out on racial bias that you might have makes you uncomfortable and defensive. So you're like, I'm going to show what a crazy idea this is to think that it's racist to not want to date black women. But in the process, I really feel like you put your foot in your mouth, and far from showing how enlightened and egalitarian and non-racist you were, you kind of did the opposite. And having a little bit of racial bias, yeah, probably everyone has bias that's unfortunate. But trying to ignore it and go, nuh-uh, you're the one, your ideas are crazy, it's not really helping the situation. So I'm not here to tell you that you're some piece of garbage. What I'm saying is maybe you should think a little deeper about this. Maybe you should open your mind a little and subject yourself to some self-examination on these sorts of things and not be so quick to have these sorts of knee-jerk reactions.